This is not how food sovereignty announces itself. It does not arrive with declarations of independence or dramatic breaks from trade relationships. It arrives as a funding announcement, $500 million from the Strategic Response Fund, $150 million for greenhouses and processing facilities, tax write-offs for agricultural infrastructure acquired before 2030. The measures sound technical. They sound like affordability initiatives. They're actually something else entirely. Most people think this is about lowering grocery prices. History suggests it was always about breaking dependency. On January 26, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced measures that Canadian media characterized as food affordability programs. The Canada Groceries and Essentials benefit, $500 million to help food suppliers expand capacity, $150 million for the Food Security Fund targeting greenhouses and abattoirs, immediate expensing for greenhouse infrastructure. The language emphasized helping Canadian families cope with rising costs. But the structure of these programs reveals a different strategic purpose. This is not subsidy to reduce prices. This is investment to reduce imports. Canada imports approximately 50% of vegetables and 75% of fruits consumed domestically. The overwhelming majority comes from the United States, 67% of vegetable imports, 36% of fruit imports. In British Columbia, 81% of spinach, 70% of lettuce, and 75% of onions come from American sources. The dependency is structural. Canadian climate limits what can be grown outdoors for most of the year. American states like California became the default supplier for produce that Canadians consume year-round. This dependency created vulnerability that tariff disputes exposed immediately. When trade tensions escalated in early 2025, Canadian consumers faced the reality that their food supply depended on stable relationships with suppliers who might suddenly become unreliable. The vulnerability was not theoretical. It was visible in grocery store prices and empty shelves. This is where leverage quietly shifts. Because the $500 million investment is not designed to make American imports cheaper. It is designed to make American imports unnecessary. The greenhouse infrastructure funding specifically targets year-round domestic production capacity. Greenhouses allow Canadian producers to grow vegetables and fruits regardless of outdoor climate. The immediate expensing provision means companies can deduct the full cost of greenhouse investments acquired after November 2025 and operational before 2030. This creates powerful incentive for rapid expansion of domestic growing capacity. The $150 million Food Security Fund targets processing infrastructure, abattoirs specifically. Canada currently processes meat in facilities concentrated in specific regions, with significant reliance on cross-border trade for both live animals and processed products. Building distributed processing capacity means Canadian livestock can be processed closer to where they are raised. It means reduced dependence on American processing facilities. It means Canadian meat production becomes less vulnerable to border disruptions. The Strategic Response Fund allocation for supply chain strengthening operates differently than traditional subsidy. The money goes to businesses making capital investments to expand capacity, not to reduce consumer prices temporarily, to build permanent productive capacity that did not previously exist. When the funding ends, the greenhouses remain, the processing facilities remain, the expanded capacity remains. Canadian food import patterns were already shifting before these investments were announced. Data from the first half of 2025 shows the sharpest quarter-over-quarter drop in American food import share since records began in 2002. Processed food imports from the United States fell 2.3 percentage points. Beverage imports fell 2.8 percentage points. This happened in Q2 2025, precisely when tariff disputes created uncertainty about cross-border trade reliability. Part of this decline was front-loading. Canadian importers rushed shipments in Q1 to avoid potential tariffs, creating artificially high Q1 numbers followed by steep Q2 declines, but part was genuine substitution. Canadian consumers actively choosing domestic products. Canadian businesses actively seeking non-American suppliers. The anything but American movement that emerged in 2025 was not organized by government. It was spontaneous consumer response to perceived unreliability of American trade relationships. The government investment announced in January 2026 accelerates and institutionalizes what was already happening organically. Consumer preference for domestic products creates demand. Government funding creates supply capacity to meet that demand. Once the infrastructure is built, it does not disappear when political relationships change. The greenhouse built in 2026 will produce vegetables for 30 years. The processing facility built in 2027 will operate for decades. These are permanent alterations to Canadian food production capacity. This is not a crisis. It is strategic repositioning. The timing is revealing. Carney's food investment announcement came immediately after his Davos speech, where he explicitly discussed the end of the rules-based international order and the necessity for middle powers to develop strategic autonomy. The speech emphasized that countries cannot rely on economic integration when integration becomes the source of subordination. Food imports from the United States represent exactly that kind of subordinate integration. Canada imports not because domestic production is impossible, but because historical trade patterns made imports cheaper than building domestic capacity. Tariff threats change the calculation. When imports become unreliable, domestic capacity becomes economically rational, even if more expensive. The $500 million investment is not charity. It is recognition that food security requires productive capacity under domestic control. Not friendly foreign control, domestic control. Over half of Canada's agri-food imports originate in the United States. Over 60% of Canadian agri-food exports go to the United States. This mutual dependence has been treated as evidence of successful integration, but the dependency is not symmetric. Canada exports products it produces efficiently: wheat, canola, livestock. Canada imports products it could produce domestically, but currently does not: vegetables, fruits, processed foods. The dependency is elective on Canada's side, structural on America's side. American farmers need Canadian markets. Canadian processors need American ingredients. But Canadian consumers could be supplied by Canadian producers if sufficient domestic capacity existed. That capacity is what the $500 million investment begins to build. The greenhouse provisions are particularly strategic. Greenhouse growing eliminates the climate excuse for imports. Canadian greenhouses can produce tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, lettuce, and other vegetables year-round. The initial capital cost is higher than field growing, but operating costs are competitive. Energy costs are manageable. Labor costs are comparable. Once the greenhouse is operational, it produces continuously regardless of outdoor temperature. The immediate expensing provision means companies can deduct the entire capital cost in the year the greenhouse enters service. This transforms the economics of greenhouse investment. Instead of depreciating the asset over 20 years, companies deduct the full cost immediately. This creates massive short-term tax benefit that makes greenhouse investment financially attractive, even for companies that might otherwise wait. The result will be a rapid expansion of Canadian greenhouse capacity over the next 4 years. Every company building greenhouses before 2030 receives full immediate expensing. This creates concentrated investment in a short time frame. By 2030, Canada will have vastly more year-round vegetable production capacity than existed in 2025. That capacity will continue operating for decades beyond the tax incentive expiration. The meat processing investment operates on similar logic. Canada has substantial livestock production: cattle, hogs, poultry. But processing capacity is concentrated in specific locations. Some livestock is shipped to the United States for processing, then shipped back to Canada as meat. This creates vulnerability. If border disruptions interrupt livestock or meat flows, Canadian consumers face shortages despite adequate domestic livestock production. Building distributed processing capacity solves this problem permanently. Abattoirs built in 2026 will process livestock for 30 years. Canadian beef, pork, and poultry production becomes independent of American processing facilities. The meat on Canadian grocery store shelves comes from Canadian livestock processed in Canadian facilities. Border disruptions become irrelevant. The National Food Security Strategy that Carney announced as part of these measures makes the intent explicit. The goal is not affordability in isolation. The goal is food security through increased domestic production capacity. Affordability is expected to follow once domestic capacity reduces reliance on imports whose prices are subject to currency fluctuations, tariffs, and supply disruptions. This represents a fundamental shift in Canadian economic strategy. For decades, Canadian policy embraced integration with American markets: lower trade barriers, deeper supply chain connections, mutual dependency treated as mutual benefit. That era is ending, not because Canada chose to end it, because American political volatility made continued dependency strategically unacceptable. Trump's tariff threats did not create this shift, they accelerated it. Canadian policymakers recognize that relationships built on trust cannot function when trust evaporates. Trade relationships that assume stable cooperation cannot survive arbitrary political disruption. The only reliable foundation for economic security is productive capacity under domestic control. The $500 million investment is modest compared to Canada's overall budget, but its strategic significance exceeds its monetary value. This represents official government recognition that food import dependency is a vulnerability requiring remedy. Once that recognition becomes policy, the trajectory is set. Future budgets will build on this foundation. Additional investments will follow. The domestic food production capacity will expand progressively until import dependency is substantially reduced. American agricultural exporters face a permanent loss of market share, not because Canadian consumers reject American products, because Canadian production capacity will replace American imports. The lettuce grown in California and sold in British Columbia will be replaced by lettuce grown in British Columbia greenhouses. The beef processed in American facilities and exported to Canada will be replaced by beef processed in Canadian abattoirs. The substitution is permanent. Greenhouse capacity built in 2026 does not disappear when trade relationships stabilize. By the time this pattern is recognized as irreversible, it will already be normal. Await further instruction.